Spoiler alert, Yugi isn't my favorite, and I actually like Yuma. Yu-Gi-Oh! Month is still going strong, and today we're gonna shine a light on the stars of our show, the Protagonists. These characters were the ones we followed from beginning to end, and more often than not, we are exposed to their individual worlds through their eyes. If you've seen my videos on the rivals and female leads, you know the drill by now. I'll be going over my thoughts on each protagonist from Duel Monsters to Arc 5, I'll give my rankings, and as a bonus, I'll be going over my first impressions of Yusaku from Yu-Gi-Oh! Reigns based on the 3 episodes that have aired at the time of this video's writing. So let's begin with our first star, or rather, stars, Yugimoto and the Pharaoh Atem. Out of all the relationships in the series, Yugi and the Pharaohs has had the most development, as it should since they're the characters we spend the most time with. And the most interesting thing about them is seeing how the way they treat each other changes over time. At first, Yugi just believed that Atem's actions were his own, and was even concerned that he could be going crazy, but after he finally does become aware of his other self, he becomes afraid of Atem, especially after he almost kills Kaiba at Duelist Kingdom. Despite the fear though, Yugi chose to trust the Pharaoh in their battle with Pegasus, and from there, their dynamic began to resemble that of 2 brothers. Now, my main hang-up with Yugi and Atem is that while the latter shows a clear change as each season goes by, Yugi gets the short end of the stick. Don't get me wrong, he does develop as a character, but while he does learn to see Atem as a friend rather than a threat, and he begins to trust in his own abilities, Atem still does most of the work in Duel Monsters. Hell, the 2 are straight up separated in Waking the Dragons, and Yugi ends up having to be rescued. Yes, the series finale does show that Yugi did mature enough to be an excellent duelist in his own right, but I think there should have been a bit more proof of that. Remember Friends Till the End, where Yugi decides to take the lead so he can save Joey? We needed more duels like that. Throughout Duel Monsters, I was always more drawn to Joey than Yugi. His more upbeat personality was always great to see, and part of me wondered what it would be like to have a character like him as the lead. And then GX came along. For the second series of Yu-Gi-Oh! We followed Jaden Yuki, or Judai Yuki as he was known in Japan. Instead of being timid or stern like Yugi and Atem respectively, Jaden was lively and exciting, which is exactly what I wanted. Nothing ever got him down, and while he enjoyed competition, at the end of the day his only motivation for dueling was to have fun. He was like a superhero almost, and the cards he used reflected that. It was simple, but it worked, and 8-year-old me loved that. Now, there's a reason why I specifically said 8-year-old me and not just me in general. For the longest time, Jaden was my favorite Yu-Gi-Oh! Protagonist, and it wasn't until Yuya's introduction in Arc 5 that I began to reevaluate my view of Jaden. Again, part of his appeal is that he's simple, but maybe he was too simple. For a very long time, most of Jaden's struggles didn't come from some vice he had or some internal struggle. They came from external sources. It wasn't until Season 3 that we started to delve a little more into his past, and then Season 4 went all out with trying to give him depth, but to be frank, they waited too long, and as a result, it ends up feeling sudden, like they took a sharp turn with the way they were writing both him and the entire GX series. When it came to tone, the other Yu-Gi-Oh! Series either gradually increased attention or kept it consistent. With GX, it just suddenly gets super dark in Season 3, and even more so in Season 4, with Jaden almost being completely unrecognizable from when we last saw him. While this is in service to the story, as it shows how badly the events of Season 3 affected his psyche, it's still very jarring from a storytelling standpoint and almost put me off a little bit. As much as it pains me to say, I don't like Jaden nearly as much as I used to. However, that's not to say that I don't still like him. He was still an enjoyable character, and it's hard for me to deny that despite being somewhat flat, he was still a great lead for the cast of GX. In 5Ds, we had Yusei Fudo. Yusei sets himself apart from Yugi and Jaden in that he's introduced as a character with a grudge. Someone wronged him, and he was willing to do whatever it took, even going to prison, to take back what was stolen from him. This is the point where people would claim Yusei to be an edgelord, but we see that while he is a very serious and somewhat intimidating person, he was still a kind soul, and it wasn't something that he hid from people. Yusei was openly selfless, and even though he had his own goals to achieve, he was willing to put them aside for a moment to help someone in need, even if it was a person he didn't know. And he rarely obsesses over his ambitions like characters in his archetype normally do. In a way, he's almost as sensitive as Yugi, if not just as much. On top of that, Yusei is also the least impulsive protagonist, choosing to think before he acts, and his dueling strategies, which revolved around using more defensive cards, clearly exemplified that. Now, here's where Yusei begins to falter for me. In the first 2 seasons, he had a personal investment in the arc's end goal. For the Fortune Cup, it was revenge. For the Dark Signers arc, it was saving Kallen. But from then on, it was just to save the city. While I wouldn't call it a generic motivation since Yusei's father helped to develop New Domino City, and thus it means a lot to Yusei personally, it is a bit less specific than his earlier motivations, and it led him to getting pretty sanctimonious at times. And towards the end of the series, the moments where he would mope about the uncertainty of his future teetered him dangerously close to the emo stereotype that a lot of fans assumed he was going to be at the beginning. Thankfully, Yusei managed to avoid falling into that trap completely, bringing the series to a strong conclusion, and overall, he was one of the more solid leads in the franchise. Which brings us to Yuma Tsukumo, the lead character of Zexal. Now, many Yu-Gi-Oh fans have railed on Yuma and Zexal as a whole, going on about how he's a bad protagonist for a bad series. But is he really? One of the first complaints that come up with Yuma is his apparent lack of skill as a duelist, but that's the point. I mean, look at his age. Yuma is only 13, the youngest of all the protagonists, and he acts like it. He's brash, impulsive, ignorant, and most importantly, inexperienced. He makes amateur mistakes because he's an amateur, and if you ask me, we needed this. Before Yuma, every protagonist had natural talent and ability. After having 3 lead characters that were naturally gifted at the game, it's refreshing to see one that learns and grows. Like Joey, Yuma goes from using random cards with unrelated effects to having a deck filled with cards that synergize with each other. Another common complaint is Yuma's childish naivete, his persistent belief that he can be friends with anyone if he just tried hard enough. But again, that plays into what he was intended to be, a child. He's optimistic, but to a fault. And despite his losses, he lived a relatively happy life with a loving family, whereas most of the other major characters have experienced some kind of tragedy. As the series goes on, we see Yuma become gradually exposed to the harsh realities that the people around him have to face. And because he's so naive, he thinks that all he has to do is be a supportive friend and that will fix all their problems. He slowly but surely begins to realize that it's not that simple, which leads up to his final duel with Shark, where all the pleading and begging in the world won't change a thing, because Shark has already made up his mind. With that said, Yuma still has some legitimate flaws. While his optimistic nature serves a purpose in the grand scheme of things, sometimes it's played up a bit too much, making Yuma occasionally cross the border into stupidity. Also, because most of the other major characters have more complex lives, there are many moments where they outshine Yuma, and he becomes a bystander while more interesting stories are going on. And while it's great that Yuma isn't the only one with major development, the way it's executed does come at the expense of his own progression. While Yuma isn't my top pick, he's definitely not as bad as a lot of fans make him out to be. As we head into Arc 5, we're introduced to Yuya Sakaki, who I feel was a better executed version of Jaden. He was the same upbeat character, but with a bit more depth. We're shown his motivation for dueling very early on, and because we know what fuels his fire, it makes me want to see him succeed. He has a lot of pride in his persona as an entertainment duelist, and finds a lot of enjoyment in giving the crowd a show. It also serves as his way of coping with stressful situations. On the other hand, while it is a source of strength, it's also a shield to keep him from dealing with more negative emotions. When Yuya is backed into a corner, either physically or emotionally, his defense mechanism is to play up his performer angle. Otherwise, he'll either crack under the pressure, or worse, in a case where he can't control his aggression, he'll go into his awakened state. Here's the problem though. The Arc 5 series has the same problem as GX and suffers from that problem just as much. It's way too crowded. While Arc 5 does do a better job at relegating the less important characters to their appropriate roles, Yuya still has a large cast of characters to compete with, including his dimensional counterparts. Plus, when Yuzu became a damsel in distress at the end of the Friendship Cup, as discussed in the last video, it came at the expense of Yuya's character too, because from then on, a lot of his dialogue amounts to, "I gotta save Yuzu, I gotta save Yuzu." I mean, yeah, she means a lot to him and I get that, but come on. Even Yugi didn't chant this much about how badly he had to save his grandpa. While it doesn't completely stagnate Yuya, since there are still many moments in the series' final third where he doesn't babble about Yuzu, it did make him a bit of a chore to deal with sometimes. So, how do these gentlemen stack up to each other? Honestly, before I started writing this video, my prediction for how my rankings would turn out was quite different from the actual results. After mulling over all the points I've gone over thus far, I decided to put Yuya at the top, then Yuma in second, followed by Yusei, then Yugi and Atem, then Jaden bringing up the rear. Which leaves one last guy to cover, Yusaku. In the 3 episodes of Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains that have come out, I like where they're going with him. While the other protagonists are generally friendly guys, Yusaku is pretty standoffish and isn't really interested in people unless they can help him achieve his goal. And the addition of Ignis provides a much appreciated reversal of the usual dynamic between the protagonist-spirit relationships that we've had until this point. Lastly, because Yusaku doesn't particularly care for people, it could mean that there's less of a chance of Aoi becoming nothing more than a love interest, so that's always good. And with that, we close out the 3rd video for Yu-Gi-Oh! Month. Next week, I'll be taking a look at Zexal and examining its merits in spite of the derision it's received from fans in what will be the final video of Yu-Gi-Oh! Month. So what do you think of the protagonists? How would you rank them? Swarm that comment section below or bug me on social media. And consider supporting me through Patreon or PayPal art commissions. Until next time, keep it sketchy, folks.